Hey listeners, Eliza and I are gearing up for a road trip through Southern California. We're exploring off-the-beaten-path food and drink spots and discovering how the state grows its incredible produce sustainably. Do you have a favorite hidden gem we should visit? Maybe a restaurant, bar, or market? We'd love your recommendations from San Diego to the San Gabriel Valley. Write us at hello@tastecooking.com to share. These special episodes, brought to you by our friends at Visit California, drop in late January. Stay tuned.
Creative people, I think, all think they need to go into creative fields. And if you watch what most of them end up doing, they're hustling more in many cases than if they had a regular job. And they're often not even doing the thing that they fell in love with when they thought they wanted to go into a creative career. It's very hard. And the reason is that everybody else wants to be a writer too.
This is Taste. I'm your host, Matt Rodbard. Steve Hoffman is a Minnesota tax preparer and food writer. Man, I love that so much. And according to Steve, when he dies, the tax preparer food writer industry will die with him. Steve is a French speaker and shameless Francophile, and his love of France shines through in his terrific memoir, A Season for That, Lost and Found in the Other Southern France. He writes with great detail and care about the story of uprooting his family to live in rural France and the many twists and turns and disappointments and revelations that come with this big life change. Now, if you've ever dreamed of moving to Europe to live a different life, this is the episode for you. A cautionary tale? Perhaps. But also, Steve is such a delight in telling his story, it may have you moving anyways. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Steve Hoffman, welcome to This Is Taste. How are you, man?
I'm good, a little bit afraid because you are one of the big ones.
Oh my gosh. Well, Steve, it's mutual. I really have enjoyed following your career and your writing. You haven't been writing your whole career. You have another job. You're a tax preparer, a real estate agent, seller, and I love the combination of skills. We were talking a little bit off mic about how it works with selling books. Mm-hmm. But tell us first, from the jump, A Season for That. Tell us about the journey that you embarked upon with your family that inspired this great memoir.
Sure. So it's set into 2012. It's based on a 6-month stay, essentially an extended fall academic semester that we spent in the Languedoc region of southern France in a tiny 800-person winemaking village. That arose, really, its very earliest origins were my taking French and being fairly good at speaking French from an early age. And then going to Paris, I took my junior year off, lived in Paris, learned to speak French more or less fluently, but also learned that there was a side of me that I didn't know existed previously, that I, as this more or less uninteresting Midwestern kid, I could walk the streets of Paris, I could function in a world capital, and that gave me a kind of intoxicating view of who I might be. And I was enraptured with France for the rest of my adult life, in part because I kept trying to recapture that persona. So in 2012, we went there, and that was really aimed at getting the kids in school. They'd taken French immersion classes throughout their elementary school careers. We wanted to cement that. We wanted to justify a lot of commuting from suburban Twin Cities to the east side of St. Paul. Mm-hmm. And we kind of thought we were along for the ride to some extent. And when we got there, we realized, no, this is an interesting place. We realized that the way that we had traveled previously, or the way I had traveled in France, was not going to work this time. And we tried very hard to immerse ourselves in this village. And after lots and lots of failure, eventually did succeed.
Yeah, no spoiling the end, but it is a journey. It is definitely like a fish out of water tale. And while you tell the story of your family, there's a lot of zoom out moments because you're such a fantastic journalist, and you get into the details of Languedoc, what the culture is in small towns, and we'll talk about what southern France is like compared with the rest of France and Paris. But let me ask you, when you move there with your family, and it's like night one, and you're sitting in your rental, and you've got these kids. Are you in a good mind space, or what's going through your head?
I would say we didn't have questions the moment we arrived or the first evening we arrived. We had questions about everything the morning after we arrived. And that was waking up to extraordinary heat, a dusty, unromantic, somewhat patched together looking village with streets that needed repair and cicadas singing. And I think we had arrived with we knew a little bit what we were getting into, but we didn't know everything we were getting into. And I think we had arrived a little bit with a romanticized Provençal idea of what we were going to be encountering. Mm-hmm. And we were in Des Moines. We were in mm-hmm. a agricultural, blue collar, working class village in a way that we were not initially prepared for.
Now, let me ask you why there, because it seems like you could have picked a different location, but clearly you wanted, maybe subconsciously, to be out there in the boondocks a little bit. I feel like this is what real like country life is like, and many want that in some ways for their families.
I think to some extent that we had the kind of experience that a lot of travelers imagine they're going to have when they go abroad, but don't stay long enough to have, or aren't willing to get off the beaten path enough to have.
So Languedoc, let's talk about the actual region, because you said Provençal, but it's not quite in that region, right? You think of Provençal, like cities that are sun-kissed. You think of like Marseille, right? That's a Provençal, right, around there. But you're in a different region.
Yeah, I would say I would equate Provence with a kind of rustic sophistication.
Got it, yeah.
A kind of elevated version of Mediterranean France. And the Languedoc is just poor, frankly. It wasn't overrun by Brits spending their money there for decades. And so I try to avoid the word authentic, but it is true to its roots in a way that Provence has, in places, lost because it has so thrown itself over to making sure that tourists are happy and making sure that it's pretty for tourists. And so when I say Languedoc, I do mean that it's a poor cousin to some extent. But what we were after was trying to become a part of a place. And that's very hard in a place where there are a lot of tourists, because the forces that push you in the direction of tourist experiences are so strong that they're very hard to overcome. And we had much less of that here. And so I think in some sense, the lack of romance was eventually what allowed us to have an almost sort of transcendently authentic experience, to use that word, where we would have struggled to have anything other than a maybe slightly deeper than average tourist experience in other parts of southern France.
So let's jump in and talk about the way food is presented in Languedoc. It's Mediterranean more than anything. It's not the butter and baguette style that you might find in northern France and Paris, of course. So what are you cooking during your time there?
I think it's interesting. I think we think of Mediterranean cuisine from this side of the Atlantic as the Mediterranean diet, which is, I think, altered in some sense to make it palatable to American palates, which are often exposed to limited spectrums of food, if that makes sense. We eat a lot of a limited number of things. And one thing that was surprising in the Mediterranean was how broad the palate is of those people there. But I also think that there is a kind of insistent rusticity about the true Mediterranean cuisine that is very much in contrast with what we think of as quote unquote French food. I think when we think of French food, we're thinking of refined technique. We're thinking of refined flavors. I think we're thinking often of restaurant and hotel food, what we have encountered in those places. And there is almost a reveling in the smelliness and the strong flavors and the lack of refinement, the lack of sophistication of the food. It really is still a place that embraces food, very fresh food, cooked very simply. Mm-hmm. But it's also insistently smelly. It's anchovies, it's garlic, it's fennel, it's pastis, it's wild boar, it's lamb. it's Roquefort, which, we think of as a fairly approachable cheese, but when you have real Roquefort, it will tear the roof of your mouth off.
Right.
So that was one of the biggest areas we needed to sort of discover and come to terms with, was just the insistent strength of the food and even the seafood that we were eating.
What are some of the struggles you mentioned? You say you had struggle after struggle to eventually having an epiphany, and no spoilers, it's near the end of the book, so we gotta let you read it. But let's talk about what it's like to actually be there with two children, right? Two
Right.
small children.
A 9-year-old son and a 14-year-old daughter.
Yeah. Okay. So you had a 14-year-old, so that's an interesting age for anywhere. But you're transplanting your family to Languedoc, and you've got a 9-year-old who is probably out there playing with the cows. So what's that like?
I think both kids thought that this experience was being imposed on them to some extent. I think our 9-year-old son, who's kind of a gentle and open-hearted person, was more willing to just go along for the ride. But our 14-year-old daughter was very convinced that it was one of the tragedies of her life that she was not at the Shoreview, Minnesota lunch table talking with her teenage friends, but was in fact in southern France. So yes, that was difficult. But I think the biggest failures that eventually led to our success were my own, and they arose out of my attitude upon arrival that this was going to be just another trip. This was going to be a light, pretty dip of our toe into a new part of France that we hadn't really experienced before. I was going to get to speak beautiful French with locals in cafes and shops, and we would let it be what it is. We would let it go at that. And really, my wife, Mary Jo, who's kind of the hero of the story and who is very much the truth teller of my life, insist at several turning points, that this is not possible, that we can't be here with them, with my family as extras in the Steve Hoffman show. I need to engage and immerse and lead if I really want France to be a part of my life, which I've wanted since I was 21 years old. And so the failures that we're talking about really were initially trying to cook my way into this place where my idea of French cooking was informed by what we just talked about, by French restaurant food, by refinement and technique and complicated recipes and long afternoons of making multiple dishes that create lots of dishwasher work. And I was sort of in some sense beaten down by my own failure, reaching a point, one of those almost sort of 12-step rock bottom points where you have no choice but to change. And I had to change my attitude.
Wow, so that's a lot to take in. As somebody who's a journalist and independent, you now need to look inward and have a real conversation with your family and make some adjustments. Clearly, there was some failure, as you write, in the beginning, but you start to slowly make adjustments. Talk about how that relates to the food, perhaps, if there's a way that the food and the agriculture around you and some of the interactions you have had with the farmers helped you look in a little more.
I think this book is a lot about acceptance. I think that's the key word that I use to guide my thoughts about the book as it evolved. It's two different levels of acceptance. There is the hard work to try to be accepted in this very insular village of 800 people in an external way. 800 people who are as much family as they are villagers, as they are fellow villagers. And that was very difficult. That was a very difficult bubble to break. There is also a story about internal acceptance, about a 45-year-old guy who has never really felt that enamored with himself and who has fought self-acceptance over much of his childhood and adult life. And what I would say is the turning point of our external acceptance happens when, again, after failing to cook my way into this region, I find a way to get on a great picking crew and understand that we're in a place that's surrounded by vines. We're about to enter the grape harvest season. And if I'm going to get to know this place and if I'm going to become a part of it, I need to be out there where everybody else is. And over the course of the book, that really is the beginning of our being considered a part of this place, of our being considered peers and crew members rather than tourists and just parents of kids who happen to go to school there. And I think by the end we reach a point of actual friendship with some people, especially the winemakers in the village. I spent a lot of time. I almost have an apprenticeship, a winemaking apprenticeship over the course of this story. And I think there is an element of their considering me a friend by the end of the book that is so unexpected and so moving to me that it almost teaches me in some sense how to accept myself, or that trying to accept myself is a worthy endeavor.
Describe the wines of the region. I think Languedoc definitely comes to mind when we're thinking about the regions of France and wine profiles. Clearly, you were invested in the wine industry there. And what drew you, I guess, to Languedoc? Apparently, that's probably one of the main reasons why you went there.
Surprisingly, no. We didn't really understand the extent to which it was a winemaking region. And I was a wine lover in the sense that I liked wine's connection with France over the course of my adult life, but I was not a wine connoisseur. I was not a wine expert by any means. Languedoc wine has a reputation that was built over a lot of years where it was making, again, it's been a poor region for a very long time. It was making not particularly good wine for the army. And it is known sort of derogatorily as the Lake of Wine. It's the largest vineyard in the world. And during the early and mid 20th century, farmers were rewarded for overproduction. They were paid by the pound or the ton. And so they would just simply push their vines as hard as possible to produce as many grapes as possible. That has just begun to change. And because it's an affordable region, there are now young organic and biodynamic winemakers who are starting to move in because they can actually afford to buy a couple hectares of vines and start a business that has a certain amount of risk to it. But it still is, I would say, an undersung region. It's a region full of strong, powerful wines. The reds are the best known. They are, in general, similar to Rhone wines with those GSM, Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre bases with Carignan and Cinsault as the secondary grapes. The white wines are difficult because the Mediterranean sun tends to bake a lot of sugar into white wine and it loses acidity and it becomes kind of flat and viscous, a little bit flabby. But there are some really beautiful and fun local white wine grapes, particularly Grenache Gris, which we ended up working with a lot because one of the winemakers that we worked the closest with was making very ambitious wines, and his favorite grape, almost for the aesthetics of it, was Grenache Gris, which also is indigenous to the region and creates an acidic wine in the south, which is hard to do and it's hard to find.
It's interesting. I think of the area. I think of like Lower Rhone, like Châteauneuf de Pape, and the big Grenaches, the big bold aged wines, and it's cool to hear Languedoc has a style that is big like the Rhone wines.
I mean, it's the same climate, you know. Yeah. They're all within a stone's throw of the Mediterranean. And one of my big discoveries that has informed my relationship with wine ever since we were there is that I now classify wine when I take a sip of it or when I think about it, not so much as from particular regions. And I talk about this in the book as well, but not so much from particular regions or continents or old world versus new world, but latitude, distance from the equator. And the Mediterranean is where grapes are meant to grow. It's where they actually reach full maturity. And when you're there for long enough, yes, these are powerful wines. Yes, they're alcoholic. They're built on alcohol and tannin, not on acid like more northern wines. But you also start to think of them as like your home base wine. And as you look at the rest of France and much northern winemaking from that perspective, you start seeing that, you know, Bordeaux to some extent, certainly Burgundy, certainly Champagne, certainly the Loire, are all actually dealing with the issue of underripe grapes.
Let's talk a little bit about your writing, because I think that's an interesting topic because, you know, you were known, at least to me, for your relative short form writing, journalism, the reporting. And I think about this with my own work, about the transition from editorial journalism, you know, 2,000, 3,000 word at the most, to like a full book. So how did you get into the mindset that this experience from 2012 would, over a decade later, become a book? I mean, you must have been thinking about it when you were there, but it took a little while. How did you make that transition from short form to long form?
It started off as a journal. I journaled extensively while we were there. I think that helped teach me a couple things. It required me to describe the same things over and over because I was describing many of the same, and primarily food and wine. And so I developed some skills around describing things accurately and sensually and immersively, because I had to describe things the first way I thought about them, and then the next layer deeper, and then yet a layer deeper. I think also writing almost daily about what our family was going through helped me to start understanding what a scene was, that it had a beginning, middle, and end, and that it needed to have some interest associated with it. It couldn't just simply be this happened and then that happened. But really, there's the story of this book. I mean, it took me 10 years to write, and I spent a lot of those years trying to just write better and better at the surface without really understanding what the storytelling techniques were that I needed to make it turn into something where people wanted to turn the page. And I encountered, in some sense, there's a failure story of my actually writing the book that parallels the failure stories that led eventually to success inside the story itself. And that is that I had a little bit of an ego. I was in love with what I could do with words on the surface of my writing. And I was refusing to admit what I was not good at. And at some point, again, I had a sort of bottoming out turning point moment where a writing coach said, after I'd been working on the book for 10 years, she said, "Steve, you're a beautiful writer, but nobody cares."
Wow. I mean, was she right?
She was absolutely right.
Okay,
and she was right because what I was doing was creating distance with my words. I was putting on a performance. I was putting on a persona. There was a kind of shield effect to my using beautiful words to describe things. What I was not doing is inviting people to get to know me.
I mean, I totally recognize the food writerly trap when you think you are writing something so great and you have a skill, but essentially you're writing in a style that, is maybe MFK Fisher, maybe Ruth Reichel, maybe Jonathan Gold, maybe someone else, but doesn't truly land you. And in a memoir, it needs to be both. It needs to be a mirror, right, of some sort, a mirror into your own existence for memoir to hit.
You need to put your messiness out there.
Yeah.
You need to accept that what you don't know and what you're not good at and what you're afraid of are things that people want to hear about and want to watch you actively try to work through. I feel as if telling the truth was something I had to learn to do. I was being accurate. I was being factually accurate. I could be fact checked, and I could put somebody in a scene well and accurately and describe things in such a way that what I was describing would arrive in the reader's head in an effective way. But I wasn't telling the truth, which I came to understand as my reaction to these moments with food or with travel that are based on the extreme weirdness and specificity of who I am based on all of the experiences I've had over the course of my life. And what that coach was really telling me was, you're not letting people get to know you, and people want to get to know you. And until you're willing to let them get to know you, you're not going to be the writer that you want to be.
So what happens then after she tells you this advice, something turns around? I mean, your work that she is making the claim that is no one cares. I mean, it becomes a book. We're here in the office of your publisher and we published your book. It's a wonderful book. I was out in July. And there must have been something that changed.
Two things, I think. First of all, she helped me understand what that meant. We went through some scene writing together that are now in the book that I'm sure you can probably recognize having read the book, where I aim for what was the most uncomfortable previously. I aim at experiences that I would have preferred not to talk about previously. So there was some training in just simply accepting that moving toward what is uncomfortable is actually a productive direction to go in rather than trying to avoid what's uncomfortable. The second thing that happened is that, again, I had one of those, as we talked about, I had a couple of these rock bottom moments. And the other was after she told me that, after 7 years of this frickin' book that nobody cares, I had to accept that there were things that I was not good at as a writer, and I needed to work relentlessly on those to get better at them. And one of them was story and structure. And so what I did was actually take a screenwriting class. And what that did is kind of wipe the table clean of my ability. It didn't matter that I could describe an apricot beautifully in the orchard of my next door neighbor in southern France. That's not what a screenplay is about. A screenplay is about narrative momentum. It's about characters that we care about. It's about conflict. And it's about ultimately getting a reader or a viewer to want to know what's going to happen next, and in a book to turn the page. And that was probably the biggest turning point of the late second half of my journey to try to get this to in publishable condition.
Did you ever think about flipping it to fiction?
Absolutely.
That must have been an interesting internal debate.
It was. But I think I really only got to the point where I could have even written it as fiction so late in the process that it wouldn't have made sense.
It wouldn't have made sense. Well, Steve, I mean, this is great to talk about craft. We don't really get to do that too often, and I'm glad we could get there. I mean, do you have any regrets from this book?
My only regrets, I would say, are that I took so long. I fought so long. I was stuck in my own. I couldn't get over myself fast enough. I spent too many years believing that I was pretty great and gathering that opinion of myself based on all the things that I did well and not peering under the rug at what I was not doing well. But that's how I was wired. That's how I was brought up. Those are my defense mechanisms to get through life. And to some extent, it could only have happened this way. I'm good at what I have always been good at, in part because I'm a perfectionist. And part of what I had to get over was my perfectionism. You can't have one without the other. So I do feel as if it's both two sides of the same coin to some extent.
We're all the more lucky, to have this book. I feel it's definitely feels like it took a lot out of your own personal life, and it seems like you sacrificed to make this book happen.
It started really as a travelogue, as a charming, witty travelogue, and it turned into something that is a lot more about life and family and being full of self-doubt and being agonized as a parent and things that people really care about. Yeah. Not everybody cares about the Languedoc region of southern France.
I mean, you haven't given it the most marketing and PR, and clearly there's a reason it works so well, because you're not writing about Nice or even Alsace-Lorraine. You're not up, in these mountains. You're in the cow piles.
Right. Yeah.
Did you ever get into the Tour de France when you were there?
We did. We spent a summer in Brittany. We spent 2 months in Brittany when the kids were even younger. Yeah. And there's a huge biking community in Brittany. We watched it come through there, but no, I was out in the fields.
You were working.
Yeah.
Have you been back to France for any extended period of time since this 2012 scene?
Yes, we actually went back 4 more times. So we went back to the same village, back to the same house. Kids went to the same schools 4 additional times because we had made friends. This was such a part of us that we didn't feel like we had exhausted the experience in 2012. And I was in the midst of debating how much we wanted to commit to the place too. And so these are, to some extent, also scouting missions. How much of the rest of our lives do we want to spend here? And if so, where and why?
Wow. So you picked up your family 4 more times?
Yes.
What type of, how long were you staying there?
Each time it was an extended semester. So it'd be between 3 and 6 months every time.
Yeah.
It was easy. I am a tax preparer. Yeah. And that is a very seasonal business. It allows me to make most of the money that our family will make for the year in the first half of the year. Mm-hmm. So, as funny as it sounds, people tend to laugh at the idea that they have a tax preparer food writer in front of them. But really, in many ways, tax preparation is what has allowed me to be a food writer, because I don't have to work every day 9 to 5 throughout the year. The second half of the year is my writing season, and I can write more what I want to write about than I could if I were chasing assignments that only paid me a certain minimum amount of money.
It's a part of the business is to have another income. Wow, Steve, I mean, listeners out there, if you want to be a food writer, pick up that seasonal job that
honestly
pays it well. I mean, can anyone be a tax preparer?
I mean, really, yeah, the bar to entry is relatively low, except that you've got to learn the freaking U.S. tax code and apply it.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you don't have to be a CPA.
Yeah.
And I do think, in a broader way, I do think this is an interesting point, which is that creative people, I think, all think they need to go into creative fields. And if you watch what most of them end up doing, they're hustling more in many cases than if they had a regular job. And they're often not even doing the thing that they fell in love with when they thought they wanted to go into a creative career. It's very hard. And the reason is that everybody else wants to be a writer too. Everybody else wants to be a food influencer. Everybody else wants to take pretty pictures on Instagram. And when there's that much competition for these very few well-paid positions in this industry, that means that pay is going to be bad. And so I have this notion of what I call self-patronage, which is, let's embrace, let be your own grant program, essentially. Let's embrace that there are fairly lucrative, fairly boring jobs that a lot of people don't want to do, that you don't have to do full time, that can buy you almost complete creative freedom. And maybe in such a case, you might even get to create more than you could if that's all you were doing, because the money from the boring job frees you up to create in a way that's productive for who you are and what you want to be.
It's amazing. It sounds like a late night TV commercial. Do something that's boring.
But wait, there's more.
For $5.99, I will tell you the secrets. And then there'll be a long list of boring jobs,
yes, right.
Like the ITT Tech commercials from the 90s. If anyone catches that references, bravo to you. Give us 3 boring jobs that probably could be lucrative and that would pay for a semester abroad, essentially. Be your own patron. I love that, Steve. I've never heard that. Such great philosophy.
Yeah, I think, and they're there. I mean, there are lots of jobs that are paying $100 to $200 an hour, right?
Yeah.
And you don't have to do them full time. If you did them half time, you can make $100,000 a year and live the rest of your life.
Yeah. Still searching for those other jobs, but you're
yeah.
Do we have to?
I mean, I think coding, right?
No, totally.
Right now,
yeah.
I think somebody could code in such a way that they would be essentially freelance. But a freelance writer is going to make $200 for an article that takes them a month to research and write, and a coder is going to make $200 in an hour.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's similar to accounting, and it's similar to, in my case, tax preparation, which is during the tax season, I'm making $500 to $1,000 an hour. I'm working also close to the full 2,000 hours. It's just all compacted in time. But I mean, I don't think it would take a whole lot of imagination to come up with a half a dozen possibilities here where you just swallow hard and realize that your job is boring. But most people's jobs are boring.
Yeah. And you're right about the point where creative endeavors, I think some folks believe they have to have a creative endeavor for all elements of their work.
You can turn life itself into your creative act.
Steve, free tax advice for our listeners. There's got to be, we're approaching that first of the year where we're going to have to start thinking about give us a little bit of free advice.
Legal or illegal?
Well then, sir. We'll call it gray. Let's get some gray advice. It doesn't have to be legal. We don't endorse illegal activity.
Correct.
But
actually, I can give you 2 variations on the same bit of advice that are that one is on the legal side and one is in the gray, not so legal.
Listener
side.
Can leave
exactly.
It to them, yeah.
So there's an expression in the tax preparation community, and it is that pigs get fed, hogs get slaughtered. Have you heard of that?
I certainly have. I've heard about Wall Street, too.
Right, exactly. It's the same thing. So you take a little bit, you push a little bit into the gray area, you reward yourself a little bit more than the IRS would like, and you're going to be very, very deep into the list of people that they're going to go after, because there's some people who are being absolutely ridiculous about what they're taking, deductions they're taking, they're making stuff up whole cloth. So I would say that's my legal gray area answer to your question. The more doubtful bit of advice is that for the last number of years and still to this day, because of the way Congress is funding the IRS, they are desperately underfunded and understaffed. And if you're ever going to try to get away with something, this is the golden age.
Again, this is just some free-flowing ideas, just 2 food writers sitting in a room. One happens to be
have no idea what they're talking about.
One happens to be a professional tax preparer. But it's really...
Do we need to end with a disclaimer here? Do I need to say this is...
I don't think so. Yeah, we've been clear enough, but this is just us, just 2 guys talking. But it's cool that you've shared your journey, and I haven't asked you a big question, which is about Twin Cities.
Yeah.
This is your town, this is your community, and what's good there right now? What's restaurant-wise, places that we should be visiting? It's a great city. I love Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the area around it. It's such a beautiful city, and
it's a great, actually, food location.
Yes.
The way that I put it is, I feel as if the Twin Cities does one thing world class in multiple realms that big cities on the coast happen to maybe have 5 or 6 examples of. But there's not much that we don't do, and what we tend to do very well. I would say the most exciting restaurants in the Twin Cities right now would be Demi, which is Gavin Kaysen's sort of highest end restaurant, most refined restaurant. I would say he's the first chef in the Twin Cities who is competing for a Michelin star, not just a James Beard Award. Trained by Daniel Boulud, obviously worked in New York, where he's worked all over. He is a world-class chef, and we have him in the Twin Cities. There's a brand new restaurant just opened by Yi of Vang. It's called Vinai. And he's been working for probably a decade to get this thing to be a brick and mortar concern. He has really single-handedly brought awareness about Hmong food to the Twin Cities, and we have the second largest Hmong population outside of Southeast Asia.
And this is the food of Laos.
It's the food of the Hmong people.
Hmong people.
Who really occupied the hills that straddled China, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam.
Thank you for clarifying. I just want to make sure our listener knew exactly who.
Exactly, yeah. About. So, and part of the challenge of trying to make people understand what Hmong food is that it's not tied to a place. Yeah. It's tied to a set of behaviors that allowed you to be essentially migratory, and always thrive. But it's a lot of the similar flavors to what you'd imagine in a Vietnamese or Thai food, but it is its own thing. And the fact that we now have a representative restaurant of Hmong food in the Twin Cities is brilliant, and he's a great chef, and it's flavorful and beautiful, and it's kind of soul food in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's our food. This is a population that's been with us since the 1970s, and it hasn't been properly represented, and it feels as if we now have representation of a major segment of the food of the Twin Cities in a restaurant.
Very cool. I must visit.
Yes, can only recommend.
On This Is Taste, we ask guests about their discerning taste. So to close this interview, here's a little rapid fire Fast and Furious taste check. Steve, are you ready?
I don't know.
Okay, right answer. The best fruit.
Have you ever had a green gauge?
No, what is that?
It is a green plum. It's also called a reine Claude in French. It is a form of plum. When it's ripe, it's green. It's one of the sweetest, most beautiful. It's got like a golden flesh. It's absolutely gorgeous.
The worst vegetable.
Raw kale.
Truly agree. The kale salad needs to be massaged. So if it's just raw.
Terrible.
Yeah.
It's always terrible.
Really, really good one. The best dessert.
I have been on a lifetime search for the perfect creme brulee.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do with the flavor. It has to do with the perfect shatter of the sugar crust on top. And I haven't quite found it yet.
My man. That's your next book right there. Let's just go there. Okay. The restaurant you are most excited to visit in the world.
It's one I've already visited. It's Asador Etzebari.
Right.
In Basque Country in northwestern Spain. All the food, it's a 3-star Michelin restaurant, but all the food is done over open flame or over wood. And it's absolutely a mind-blowing restaurant.
Your favorite cookbook of all time?
Richard Olney's The French Menu Cookbook. I'm an absolute devotee of Richard Olney. He's one of my culinary, literary, lifestyle heroes. I worship the man. And that's one of the most beautifully written cookbooks I've ever set eyes on.
Favorite city outside America to visit for food?
Sète, which is a fishing village on the southern coast of France in Languedoc, where I feel as if I found myself every time I go there.
And do you go back often?
Yes.
Oh, that's amazing. When's your next trip to France? When are you booked?
Probably next year after we're done. My wife just published a book this year as well, and we're both promoting like crazy. And when we finally are done promoting, then we'll probably go back to France.
What's her book? Let's promote it.
It's called Still, The Art of Noticing. She actually started an art photography project in that same time that this book is written.
Yeah.
It's been now 12 years. She takes a photo every day of nature found near her, posts it online, has never missed a day in 12 years.
Wow.
So she's on image number 4,700 and something. She's never missed a single day of taking a photo. No Christmas holiday, no sick days, her dad died days. And she just published a book of her images and of her essays about the creative process.
About the process. Wow, what a cool book.
And it sold out instantly. Sold out within a week. She's on her 3rd printing.
Oh, amazing. That's a great project. Are you ever in the photos as a cameo, or is it of only landscapes?
It's only bits of nature composed on a white background, so there's no human beings and there's no domesticated plants. It's all wild nature found nearby.
Wow.
It's an amazing project.
What a great
It's a mind-bending project.
Last question, your favorite sandwich?
This is actually a Minnesota plug. It is a BLT with the season's first tomato, with lettuce from a producer named Frisk Fraboxen, which means fresh from the box. He makes the best lettuce I've ever had in my life. He works out of Shoreview, right next to my home, with bacon from Thielen Meats in Piers, Minnesota, And my only non-Minnesota plug is I love Kewpie mayonnaise more than Hellman's or Miracle Whip. And I generally don't make my own mayo to have a BLT. But yeah, a midsummer BLT, kind of double-decker, it doesn't get any better.
And with those products from the upper Midwest,
yes,
enjoy that. Steve Hoffman, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining This Is Taste.
This is so cool to get so deep with you. I appreciate it.
This Is Taste is hosted by Eliza Abarbanel and me, Matt Rodbard. The show is produced by Shalia Harris and Pat Stango and edited by Clayton Gumbert. Theme music by Steve Rydell. Visit Taste online at tastecooking.com and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for updates on all cool things that are happening.